In life, when one begins to notice that something no longer fits, that certain conversations become tiresome, that some places lose their meaning, and that there are relationships that used to provide peace but now drain energy, one does not leave with anger or scandal. One leaves in silence, not out of resignation, but because the noise outside can no longer drown out the inner voice that is beginning to awaken. That voice that whispers that the time has come to let go of what hurts, even if it still hurts to do so. The process has no applause or witnesses. No one notices when you begin to retreat. You simply stop forcing yourself to fit in where there is no longer room. You move away from the habits that consume you, from the thoughts that sabotage your peace, from the characters you play in order not to lose approval. At first it feels strange, as if you are betraying something. But with time you understand that all you are doing is choosing yourself. The true personal revolution does not make noise. It happens in the small details, in the everyday, in that silent decision to stop living based on guilt or fear. Because there is a huge difference between keeping quiet out of fear and keeping quiet out of peace. The silence of fear encloses, the silence of peace liberates. When one understands this, one begins to look inward with a different honesty. Many times we believe that we must remain the same in order to maintain connections, to not dismantle what is known, but that has a cost. Pretending, simulate enthusiasm, pretend to agree, act interested when you no longer care. We hold empty conversations, automatic gestures, soulless smiles, all to avoid conflict. But that apparent harmony is a form of subtle violence against oneself, because true peace does not consist in avoiding arguments, but in ceasing to live in internal war. Choosing oneself is not always glorious. Sometimes it feels uncomfortable, lonely, contradictory. However, that is where the authentic happens, because only when we stop acting in order to be accepted does who we really are begin to emerge. And that emergence, even though it hurts, brings a new breath, a different coherence. Not perfection, but an alignment between what we think, feel, and do. The price of pleasing everyone is usually ceasing to please ourselves, and in that attempt, in order not to lose anyone, we end up losing our essence. There comes a time when the body knows before the mind does. A lump in the throat appears, as does emotional fatigue, a silent emptiness, eso, signs that announce that something in the soul is asking for change. And that change doesn't need announcements or explanations, just an act of internal honesty that says, I can no longer continue living in a borrowed version of myself. Many times we believe that postponing is prudent, that waiting for the perfect moment is a sign of maturity, but over time we discover that postponing is also a form of renunciation, a renunciation disguised as calm, preparation, or strategy. What it usually hides deep down is fear. Fear of making a mistake, fear of judgment, fear of accepting that it is time to move, because life does not stop while one hesitates. Time keeps moving forward, and with it, opportunities to live a fuller life slip away. We live as if we had spare lives, as if there were always another opportunity, another more propitious day, another version of events where everything would be easier. But many times that day never comes. What was going to be a pending conversation turns into distance. What was going to be a project turns into regret, and what was going to be a courageous decision ends up becoming a question that will haunt us. What if inaction also leaves scars even if they are not visible? Every time we put off something important for later, our soul shrinks a little, and even though no one notices, we feel like we are betraying ourselves. Procrastination is not just a problem with scheduling. It is an emotional disconnect with what we consider essential. Because when we postpone what gives us meaning, we begin to live a diluted version of ourselves. It is not about doing everything at once or running after time. It is about accepting that the present is the only real territory where we can make a change. Tomorrow is not guaranteed, and understanding this should not generate anguish, but clarity. Clarity to ask ourselves honestly what we continue to say about the future, what part of ourselves we continue to leave for later as if it were not important. The life we dream of does not begin when everything is in order. It begins when we decide to take charge, with everything in fear, with everything in doubt. Many wait for external signs, a push from destiny, absolute certainty, but the sign is almost always within. It is that unease that does not subside, that sigh that escapes when we feel we are stuck, that discomfort of living far from what we truly desire. We do not need more signs. We need courage. The courage to move forward even if the inner voice trembles, to take a step without guarantees, to accept that not acting also has a price. Because waiting forever is also a choice. It is choosing stillness, indecision, silent resignation. And we must ask ourselves, how much longer are we going to wait to live the life we know we want? Not so that others can try it or so that it fits into what is expected, but so that we can look at ourselves with serenity and feel that at least today we inhabit our existence with presence and not with fear. The past has a silent way of settling in us. It doesn't make a sound, ooh, but it stays. Well, it lodges in the thoughts that recur, in the emotions that we don't understand, in the reactions that don't match the present. We think we've overcome it because we stopped talking about it, but silence doesn't always mean healing. Many times it's just an elegant way of surviving, and what is not reviewed repeats itself. There are wounds that don't heal with time, but with awareness, because pain doesn't dissolve just by stopping feeling it, but when one looks at it head on and decides to stop feeding it. The past is strengthened every time we use it as an excuse. Every time we relive the scene over and over again, every time we define ourselves by what was done to us or by what we failed to avoid. Understanding that something hurt us doesn't mean we have to keep living from that wound. Healing is not about erasing it is about integrating. It is remembering without it hurting the same. The ability to state, yes, it scarred me, yet it now dictates nothing. That is the difference between carrying a story and learning from it. And that process requires patience, because the mind seeks explanations, it wants to find meaning in everything, but there are things that don't have it. There are mistakes that simply happened, people who didn't know how to care, and versions of ourselves that will never return. Insisting on understanding everything is sometimes a way of not letting go. As long as we remain tied to the past, we become hostages to a story that is already over. We react from old defenses, we interpret the present through the eyes of yesterday, and we end up repeating relationships that remind us of what we did not resolve. That is why healing also means stopping telling the story as a victim, not to deny what happened, but to regain power over what comes next. Suffering does not redeem. Punishing ourselves does not repair what happened. It only prolongs the pain. We are no fairer to ourselves by continuing to mentally replay what we can no longer change. When forgiveness comes, it is not always said out loud or implies reconciliation. Sometimes it simply involves deciding not to continue dragging on what is no longer repairable. It is not about justifying or forgetting, but about stopping poisoning the present with an old poison. You are not obligated to forgive, but it is worth asking yourself if that resentment protects you or imprisons you, if it gives you strength or takes away your peace. Because resentment hardens the heart and makes it distrustful, making it incapable of loving unconditionally. And one has to decide if they want to continue living from the wound, or if they are willing to build from freedom Forgiving is not a favor to the other person, it is an act of compassion for yourself. It is the quietest and most powerful way to close a cycle. It is not achieved overnight, but it begins the moment you stop feeding the fire. When you choose emotional rest over mental revenge, and although it may seem like an invisible act, it is one of the greatest gestures of self-love that exists. There are relationships that are not companionship. They are temporary refuges from emptiness, bonds that are born from the fear of being alone, not from the genuine desire to share. And when someone confuses love with need, they begin to give away parts of themselves in exchange for something that is not even fulfilling. They call it love, but it is fear. They call it commitment, but it is dependency. And from the outside, everything seems normal. There is laughter, photos, shared routines, but inside someone is slowly fading away, accepting emotional crumbs as if they were gestures of affection. A healthy relationship should not cost you your dignity. It should not ask you to shrink so that the other person feels comfortable. Love that nullifies, that demands silence, or that turns your boundaries into threats is not love, it is control. And many times we accept it because we grew up believing that love was enduring, that giving was synonymous with sacrifice, but there is no possible love where one must disappear so that the other person can remain. Emotional dependency is a form of invisible slavery. One becomes convinced that one cannot live without the other, that one's value depends on their presence, that one's identity is sustained in that relationship, and so freedom is lost, not because the other takes it away, but because one surrenders it. When that happens, the relationship ceases to be an encounter and becomes a form of survival. No one comes to complete you. That romantic idea of the better half has done more harm than good. Love should not be a search for what you lack, but rather a space to share what you already have. Coming whole is the only way to build something true, because those who seek themselves in the other end up depending on their reflection to feel alive. It is not about closing off relationships, but rather about coming with maturity, about being able to say, I love you, without it meaning without you, about sharing from abundance, not from lack. When one learns to take care of oneself, one also learns to choose differently. One no longer seeks someone to save oneself, but someone to accompany oneself. One no longer needs to be validated at every step because one understands that one's value does not depend on the gaze of others. True love shouldn't hurt like this. It shouldn't generate constant anxiety or fear of abandonment. Real love is a refuge, not a storm. And if listening to it makes you feel uncomfortable, perhaps it's because you recognize parts of yourself that still love from a place of fear. That's okay. Recognizing it is already part of awakening. Because emotional freedom doesn't mean not loving it means loving without losing yourself. It involves building a relationship with yourself so solid that no absence destabilizes you. Loving from choice, not from necessity. And when one achieves that, love stops being a prison disguised as a promise and becomes what it was always meant to be. An encounter between two complete people who choose to walk together without chains or emotional debts. Worrying about what hasn't happened yet is a silent way of escaping from the present. The mind creates scenarios, imagines losses, anticipates mistakes, and the body, which can distinguish between what's real and what's imagined, reacts the same. It tenses up, speeds up, and becomes exhausted. That's how we end up living on alert, not because of what's happening, but because of what we think could happen. And that accumulated wear and tear day after day becomes a permanent state of anxiety. We convince ourselves that anticipating the bad protects us as if being prepared for disaster were a form of control. But in reality, this mechanism robs us of the only moment we have, the now. When the mind gets ahead of itself, the soul lags behind and life, instead of feeling lived, becomes an endless list of possible threats. We want to be in control of everything: what we think, what we feel, what others will do or say. We confuse control with care, but control doesn't protect, it suffocates. Trying to anticipate every reaction, every word, every outcome is a way of denying uncertainty, of resisting the natural flow of life. And the paradox is that, by doing so, we are already suffering in advance. Control is born of fear. Fear of losing, thor. Fear of not being enough, barpia. Fear of not being able to handle what comes. But life has never been something to be controlled, to be experienced, to be inhabited, to be learned from. And when one stops fighting with uncertainty, something changes. A new calm emerges, not because things are resolved, but because one stops exhausting oneself trying to resolve the unresolvable. Returning to the present does not require great techniques or spiritual promises. Sometimes all it takes is to stop, breathe, and ask oneself, is this thing that worries me happening now, or am I just imagining it? Is there something I can do right now, or am I just going around in circles with the same thoughts over and over again? Anxiety is often not a problem of the future, but a disconnection from the present. And the way to heal is to predict what is coming, but to regain the ability to be here, to observe what is happening, what you can touch, what you can change. The rest, no matter how much you think about it, will still be out of your control. It is not about becoming carefree or living without responsibility. It is about trusting a little more in your ability to adapt. Remember, you have overcome things that at the time seemed impossible. You have survived days that you thought you would never make it through. So why do you continue to doubt yourself so much? When you stop anticipating fear and start trusting in your own strength, life becomes lighter, not perfect, but more livable. And there, in that lightness, lies true serenity. Not the absence of problems, but the certainty that you will be able to handle them when they come. Holding on to a grudge is a way of staying tied to the hurt. You think that by keeping it alive you are defending yourself, that your anger serves as a reminder of what should not happen again, but in reality, what it does is chain you to the past. It's like swallowing poison hoping the other person gets ill. Every thought loaded with resentment reopens a wound that was already trying to heal, and little by little you wear yourself down without realizing it. The cruelest thing about resentment is that many times the other person is no longer there, doesn't know, doesn't understand, or simply doesn't care, and you're still holding on to an emotion that eats away at you inside. Forgiving doesn't mean justifying what happened, or reconciling, or forgetting. Forgiving in its most human form is releasing the energy that got trapped in that story. It's a silent decision to stop rehashing the pain, as if doing so has some healing power. There are no formulas or time frames for forgiveness. Each process is different. Some feel it as sudden relief, others as a slow acceptance that comes little by little, like clarity after a storm. But what is common is that when it comes to, it feels light, asas, not because it erases the past, suhasas, but because it stops directing the present. Forgiveness is not about kindness, it's about health. It's a way of telling the soul that it no longer needs to hold on to what's hurting it. You're not weak for letting go, you're wise for not feeding the fire anymore. Because as long as you keep replaying the scene in your mind, now you're not processing it, you're reliving it. And reliving hurts more than remembering. You have to ask yourself honestly, what resentment is still taking up emotional space inside you? What name? What face? What memory keeps popping up when you think all is calm? And more importantly, who would you be if you could truly let go of that? Emotional maturity is not about denying what happened, vasha, but about accepting that pain, no matter how unfair it was, can no longer be changed. The only thing you can change is the relationship you have with it, and that transformation does not need witnesses. It is an intimate, silent, deeply personal process. Letting go is not forgetting, it is deciding to stop carrying. It is understanding that not everything has an explanation, that not every wound leaves an immediate lesson. Some only leave a scar, and that scar does not have to hurt forever. Learning to live with it without it directing you is a form of freedom. There comes a moment along the path when one must choose whether to continue being a victim or become the protagonist of one's own story. And that decision marks a before and after, not because everything changes suddenly, but because from that moment on life is no longer lived from the wound, but from the consciousness. And when that happens, the past loses its power because it ceases to have nourishment. We were taught to see happiness as a goal, as a reward that comes after fulfilling all social requirements, a stable partner, a respectable job, an accepted image. We grew up believing that happiness was at the end of the road, but the truth is that it was never there, because when we reach one goal, another one immediately appears, and so we enter an endless race, running relentlessly after a satisfaction that dissolves as soon as we touch it. Happiness is not a finish line, it is a way of being present. It is an internal coherence between what you value, what you do, and what you allow. When these are aligned, even the simplest days feel full. Even the mundane has meaning, not because everything is perfect, but because you have stopped waiting for something external to come and complete you. Well, that constant waiting, that promise that when I have this, I will be happy, is a trap. A trap that keeps us dissatisfied, always looking forward and disregarding what we already have. The problem is not having goals. The problem is conditioning calm and joy on their fulfillment. Because when well-being depends on the result, any obstacle becomes a threat, and any delay feels like failure. True happiness is not found, it is built. It is built in small gestures, in how you speak to yourself, in the decisions you make each day, in the way you treat others and yourself. It does not come with fanfare or great achievements. It appears in silence, in the serenity of knowing that you are being true to who you are. Society has sold us a superficial version of happiness, wrapped in consumption and appearances. But true happiness is more humble and at the same time more challenging. It is not about accumulating, but about letting go, about stopping looking outside for what can only be found within. And when one understands this, something falls into place inside. Life no longer needs to be perfect in order to enjoy it. Perhaps the question is not, what do I need to be happy? But rather, what am I ignoring today that could already be good for me? Maybe because many times happiness is already here. Maybe we just don't see it because we are busy looking for something else. Being happy is not a permanent state. It is a daily practice. It is appreciating the simple, accepting the imperfect, and recognizing the value of what you have before it is gone. It is living with the awareness that this moment, the one you are breathing right now, is already part of what you have waited for so many times. When you stop chasing happiness as if it were a trophy, you begin to experience it for what it truly is. A form of inner stillness, a serene balance between reality and desire. And that, right there, is where life begins to feel more alive, not because everything is resolved, but because you are present in it. Explaining yourself all the time is tiring, It tires the body, but above all, it tires the soul. That constant need to justify what you feel, what you decide, what you choose to leave behind, comes from the fear of not being understood. We live asking for permission to be who we are, as if we needed someone to authorize us to exist in our own way. But when you live seeking approval, you lose your way. They can no longer tell if they act from conviction or fear of disappointment. You are not obligated to give reasons for every step you take. You do not have to explain your silences, your distances, or your changes. There are decisions that do not arise from logic, but from conscience. And that conscience does not always have words, it only has certainties. Certainties that are felt that cannot be translated, but that push forward the need to justify oneself. Many times it has ancient roots. It comes from having grown up under gazes that demanded obedience, perfection, or performance. Gazes that taught us that in order to deserve affection, we had to behave in a certain way. But we are not those children anymore. We are no longer obligated to convince anyone of our value. Every time you find yourself over-explaining your limits, stop. Ask yourself if you are doing it to be understood or to be forgiven for choosing yourself, because many times what we are looking for is not understanding but permission, and constantly asking for permission to take care of yourself is a form of emotional abandonment. There will be those who do not understand your changes, who will be offended because you stopped pleasing them, who will interpret your silence as coldness. And that's also part of the process. You can't control how others perceive your evolution. The only thing you can take care of is that your choices are aligned with your truth, not with the expectations of others. Being true to yourself sometimes means disappointing others, and even though it hurts, that disappointment is not your responsibility. Everyone reacts from their own emotional map. Your task is not to soften the impact of your authenticity, but to sustain it with respect. Because living from coherence is not always comfortable, but it is always necessary. There comes a point when explaining yourself no longer makes sense, not out of pride, but for peace. Not because you have become indifferent, low, but because you have understood that those who truly want to understand you do not need speeches. Actions speak louder than any explanation. Living in coherence is not easy, but it is liberating. It means acting according to what you feel. Even if it makes you uncomfortable, it means stopping seeking approval in order to find serenity. Because when you choose from clarity, external noise loses power, and then for the first time you discover what it really means to be at peace with yourself. Don't convince anyone. Don't justify yourself. Just live in congruence with your own truth. Taking care of yourself is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity. However, many times we leave it for the end, as if physical and emotional well-being were something secondary. We sleep little. We eat without attention. We live connected to screens surrounded by constant noise. We call it routine, but in reality it is abandonment. A slow, almost imperceptible abandonment that gradually pays for clarity, patience, and the ability to feel deeply. The body speaks long before the mind. When something in us is disconnected, the body gets ahead of itself. It gets tired for no reason. It loses energy. It tenses up and we interpret it as stress or fatigue, temporary. But it is almost always a way of saying, enough is enough. Because the body doesn't lie. Only we silence it with distraction, with excess, with speed. We live stimulated all the time, with no space for silence and without silence. There is no inner listening. Being alone with oneself has become uncomfortable, because that's where everything we avoid appears. Fear, sadness, truth. But it is precisely in that encounter where healing begins. No one can hear themselves amidst the noise. Bad habits are not noticed immediately. They accumulate slowly. Every night without rest, every rushed meal, every time you ignore an emotion, you are wearing down your system. And one day, without realizing it, the body stops you with anxiety, insomnia, exhaustion. And what you interpret as weakness is actually an urgent request for attention. You don't need to turn a fanatic about wellness or following rigid routines. It's about responsibility, not perfection. It's about understanding that the mind cannot sustain itself if the body is in disarray. Taking care of yourself means taking care of your mental clarity, your emotional balance, your ability to love and decide lucidly. Self-care is not selfishness, it's ethics. It's the most concrete way to honor the life you carry inside. Because every gesture you make to be well, to rest, to feed yourself, to breathe calmly, to set limits is a silent declaration of self-love. I want to sustain my life with dignity. And although it may seem like a minor detail, those daily decisions are what change everything over time. Because when you improve your basic routines, your outlook on the world also improves. You think more clearly, you feel more deeply, you choose with more awareness, and that's more than a goal. It's a way of life. Perhaps the most honest question one can ask oneself is, how am I treating the body that sustains everything I am? Not from a place of demand or guilt, but from a place of gratitude. Because this body is the instrument through which I can live, from which we think, love, and create. And when we take care of it, we are not only protecting our health, but our ability to be present in life. In the end, everything we do, letting go of the past, choosing ourselves, forgiving, loving, resting, has the same purpose. Learning to be at peace with ourselves. Not a perfect or eternal peace, but one that is built silently each day with each act of consciousness. Because true transformation makes no noise. It is only noticeable in the serenity with which you begin to live.